In these videos, we've been thinking about lies, lies that promote sin and make us vulnerable to sin. Now, what I want us to realize is the danger is not just individual lies. What happens when we start to believe a lie is that we end up adopting a mindset. And it's these mindsets that are even more lethal than the individual lies, such that if you start to believe these lies regarding temptation and sin, you can end up with a mindset of rebellion. You can end up with a mindset of indifference about sin. But here's what I want us to think about in this video, is you can also end up with a mindset of despair, where you cannot see or recognize the grace of God because you think you're too steeped in your sin. There's no hope left for you. And guys, that is such a dangerous mindset to adopt. Now, what are the lies that lead to despair? I'm going to pick up one, and I've already referred to it. It's the lie that I'm too far gone, that I've drifted so far out on the waters of sin that God's arm can no longer reach me. His grace is no longer for me, and so all I can do is just continue with the current of sin in my life. Now, guys, in order to show the lie of that lie, I want us to think about Judas and I want us to think about Peter. I want us to think about them specifically when Jesus is crucified, and to recognize the difference in the lives of these two men and to think about the relevance of that difference for us. If you were to ask yourself the question, on the night Jesus is betrayed leading up to his crucifixion, which man committed the worst sin, Judas or Peter? I'll be honest, it's hard to tell. On the one hand, you've got Judas, he betrays Jesus to the officials. On the other hand, you've got Peter, who resolutely said he'd never deny Jesus, and then he denies him 3 separate times. You put them toe-to-toe, and they're both terrible friends. They both sinned against God. They both were treacherous to Jesus. And so, again, they're equally guilty in many respects before Christ. And yet think about the end of the story of each of these men. On the one hand, you've got Judas, who does succumb to that attitude of despair and consequently takes his own life. On the other hand, you've got Peter, who ends up restored to Jesus, forgiven, and actually is commissioned as an apostle to carry on the work of Christ. Now, what's the difference? Was there no grace available to Judas? If Judas would have sought grace and forgiveness, would he have found it at the feet of Jesus? Yes, he would have. What we see in these two stories is we see the danger. We see, in a sense, what happens if you succumb to despair and lose sight of the grace of God, versus what we see in Peter's life is really the heart of God, the way that God goes out and seeks us. And his grace is so great that there is always forgiveness. There's always redemption available to us. And so what do we learn from this? Well, guys, if you feel like you're Peter, if you feel like you've betrayed Jesus, if you think you've committed the unforgivable sin, what you need to recognize is that if Peter was able to be forgiven, and there's a whole list of people like Peter. We can think of David, we can think of Moses, we can think of most of the great people of the Bible who committed terrible sins and yet found grace with God. If these men were able to be forgiven and find grace with God, well, guess what? We can as well. And so, guys, let me just encourage you. Don't believe the lie that you're too far gone. What you need to do, if you feel the tentacles of sin just strangling you, is you cry out for mercy. You break down before God. You just open up your heart, you weep at his feet, and say, cleanse me of my sin. Break the chains of my bondage. Men, those are prayers, they don't go unanswered in heaven. And so look out for that mindset of despair. Don't adopt it, resist it. Look to Peter, let him be an example to you. Look to Paul, the persecutor of the church, who also became an apostle. If such men as Peter and Paul were restored to God through the work of Jesus, then there's grace and forgiveness for you and for me as well.